Where we were starting was with the present day. So, if you were trying to get somebody into heavy metal and explain to them what it is, I think there's a big difference between younger generations and older generations. And it has to do basically with experiences, but also with how metal is being portrayed culturally. So I think that younger people might develop their perspectives very naturally on the basis of the present and the recent past of metal as a genre, coupled with some narratives of a legendary past, but also access to just an unparalleled set of resources, the ability to listen to entire catalogs of music. So that's one vantage point, right? I think that it's a bit different for those who came up when metal was a young and developing genre that was made to appeal to, at that time, youths, now older people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, maybe even 70s. If we look at some of the band members, they, developed their understanding and engagement with the music in more haphazard but also more experiential manners. So, learning about the emergence of American thrash metal in the early mid 80s out of engagement with what was called speed metal and the new wave of British heavy metal, that was something that, Rob and I, for example, lived through. And it gives you a different perspective having gone through it, not necessarily a better perspective, but a different perspective. And so I think there's different and changing modalities for listening to and learning about and also living out a lifestyle of metal from era to era. And there's also been some massive changes due to the development of the internet and its penetration of pretty much every aspect of our waking lives. So what would somebody who wants to learn about heavy metal, what it means, what it encompasses, from the vantage point of the present do? They might go to a variety of websites to learn about what heavy metal is or means, or what the boundaries of the genre are supposed to be, or to learn about histories or discographies or classifications or influences of bands. They might go to Wikipedia, they might go to Encyclopedia Metallium, they might go to a whole bunch of different places, right? And you're also getting it, if you use any streaming service, it's already built into it. They're telling you this is metal, this is not metal. And sometimes they take classic bands that we think are metal and they say, no, that's just hard rock, and other bands are classified as metal who might not actually fit into that. People who are approaching it from the present might be really, really interested in subgenres of heavy metal that weren't there originally. Like they might be into funeral doom metal or symphonic black metal or all these kind of niche areas. By contrast, somebody who started forming their ideas about heavy metal back in the earlier years of the 70s and the 80s might place less stress on these subgenre divisions because a lot of those didn't exist at that time, or they were just emerging, and they might be more interested in the legacies and narratives and music of the bands and artists that were around in that formative period. And their knowledge base is likely something that's kind of cobbled together over time, in part because epistemologically, we didn't have access to all of those resources. If there was a cool band that we heard on the radio, you might have to go to the record store and ask somebody about it, and they might not have any idea what you're talking about, or you would hope that it gets mentioned in a magazine that you could buy once a month. There was no internet to go to. So a lot of the knowledge base was rather cobbled together. And I do want to say, before we jump into looking at the 70s, there's three mistakes that I think metalheads can fall into easily that have to do with this aspect of time or temporality. So I think some people have a too one-sided focus on the present, which would include, there's no such thing as the absolute present. There's the recent past, the foreseeable future. And so they'd be into all the bands that are around today. And that's the way they look at it. And they wouldn't be all that interested in engagement or appreciation of the past. They're interested in what's going on. What does the scene look like right now? And then there's two past focused ways that I think people sometimes go wrong too. One of these would be the opposite, and it's sort of a sacred museum memorialization kind of approach, right? Where people want to know everything about, say we take Motorhead, for example. You learn everything about it. And the early albums, it was Fast Eddie playing guitar. And then they had Brian Robertson. And then they had, Wurzel and Phil Campbell and this drummer and that drummer. And you can say, well, what do you think about Motorhead's latest album? And of course, latest album is kind of dated because Lemmy's been dead for a while. And they're like, oh, I mean, I haven't listened to any Motorhead since 2000. I just only listened to the early stuff. And I've got all the merch and memorabilia. Well, I mean, that's a little weird. It's not retaining an aspect of connection to the present. You're living in a past. It's sort of like any other fandom where people are into, I don't know, cartoons from the 1980s. And they're not willing to talk about the contemporary stuff. And then I think that there's a kind of middle of the road thing as well that you see with some fans, where they only focus on the big hits from the good old days. And this is a different sort of memorialization. And a good friend of both Rob and I, Scott Truly, who's a guitar professor at Berklee School of Music, one of his pet peeves is he goes to Def Leppard concerts, and Def Leppard just plays stuff from the album Hysteria and some things from Pyromania, and then very little from any new albums. And they also don't play the stuff that actually made them famous originally, which is from their first two albums. And why do they do that? Because the fans come demanding, I just want to hear the hits, pour some sugar on me, things like that. I don't want to hear the new crap, well, that's a mistaken sort of attitude, I think, that some people have. So there's, when it comes to time and temporality, we can fall into some perspectives that lose some of the richness of what's going on. So speaking of richness, let's look at the 1970s. And I'm going to probably unfairly criticize a, person that some people call a metal god, Rob Halford, for a fake narrative, a misleading narrative that he routinely puts forward, sometimes actually at concerts. And it runs like this. Where did heavy metal begin? What's the right answer that everybody knows? Black Sabbath. In 1970, the album Black Sabbath, and Black Sabbath was doing their thing, and it was this new kind of music, and it was unprecedented and dark and tough and hard and metallic, and people were kind of into that. And then they were really the only pioneers doing that until in 1974, Judas Priest brought out their album Rock-a-Rolla. Now we've got two major metal bands on the scene, and Judas Priest kind of took over the mantle. And for the rest of the 1970s, nobody else was really doing any heavy metal. Well, there was of course Motorhead, but they were doing a different kind of thing. And Rob Halford puts this out, and this has actually made its way into books about heavy metal because people have kind of uncritically assumed that he must be telling the truth about this sort of thing. And I'm not going to say that he's deliberately lying or anything, because I don't know his state of mind, but it's clearly not the true narrative. So you talked, about proto metal, and there's a whole bunch of bands that we could put in there: the Kinks, the Who, Jimi Hendrix, Cream, Vanilla Fudge, Blue Cheer, Iron Butterfly, the Edgar Winter Group, MC5 in Detroit. What do they have in common? The sound is getting heavier, harder, more metallic as time goes on. Amplifiers are being turned up. The bass is assuming a much greater role in these compositions. People are soloing. They're using early distortion, which is usually generated from the amplifiers rather than pedals or effects like that. And that's not yet heavy metal, but it's pretty close. And some of the songs that you might think about, like Blue Cheer's Summertime Blues, taking a blues standard, turning it into proto metal. That's all happening in the late 60s. And what would have happened if Jimi Hendrix hadn't have died? Who knows? He would have definitely been part of the metal scene. And then in 1970, it's not just Black Sabbath that comes out. Deep Purple brings out a heavy metal album as well. Led Zeppelin is in the background. Are they heavy metal or just bluesy hard rock? There's debates about that. I'm willing to say that some of their stuff is heavy metal. UFO 1 comes out in 1970. Uriah Heep's first album comes out in 1970. In 1971, we get a Welsh band, Budgie. They are definitely heavy metal. First album is out then. Sir Lord Baltimore over here in the United States, who tour with Black Sabbath, their first album is in 71 as well. In Japan, the Flower Traveling Band puts out the album Satori, which is clearly a metal album if we look back at it. Thin Lizzy, who's a band that arguably is metal adjacent, 1971, they're putting out an album. Scorpions put out their first album, Lonesome Dove, in 72. Not really that metal, but their next albums are going to be. And we get all sorts of other people as well. In Detroit, we've got Alice Cooper. New York, we've got Blue Oyster Cult. In Philadelphia, there's a band called Bang. Their first metal album comes out in 72. Aerosmith, their early stuff is arguably heavy metal. They're coming out in the early 70s. The Amboy Dukes and Ted Nugent put out a first metal album in 73. In Cleveland, we have Granicus in 73. Montrose gets formed that same year. And then in 1974, we get two really important bands. One of them is Judas Priest, who've been around for a while. They put their first album out in 74. But we also have in New York City, Kiss. Massively important. First album, 1974 as well. All of these are bands that will be identified as heavy metal. And you can listen to them from the vantage point of later metal and say, I don't know, maybe more hard rock than heavy metal. But for what counted as heavy metal at the time, all of them were solidly within that. And Kiss actually billed themselves as heavy metal to try to promote their music. So some of them toured together. There's a good chance if you were into one of these bands, you probably like the other bands as well. Now, the term heavy metal was kind of a loosey-goosey idea, and it's not very helpful to try to trace it back to Steppenwolf, having heavy metal thunder in their lyrics or anything like that. What we want to do is look at when were the fans actually calling this stuff heavy metal, or when were the musicians saying, yeah, we play heavy metal stuff? A lot of the time, they wouldn't necessarily call it heavy metal. They might call it heavy rock or a heavy band. But there's a clearly identifiable sonic landscape that they share and meander around in. Now, at the time, though, there's other bands that are being called heavy metal. This just goes to show you how far this term can stretch, that when you listen to now, you're like, how did anyone consider that heavy metal? Grand Funk Railroad was considered a heavy metal band. Canned Heat was also considered a heavy metal band, maybe with a little bit more accuracy. King Crimson was sometimes called a heavy metal band when really they're much more like a prog band. Later in the 70s, Queen will get called a heavy metal band as well and included on heavy metal anthologies. So we've got this early, let's call it primordial soup with all these interesting bands and musicians, sometimes going back and forth, like UFO managed to entice the Scorpions lead guitarist, Michael Scheckner, away from the band to join them. So every once in a while they tour together, poach from each other, and they're all listening to each other. They're sharing this. And people are writing about this. Most of the writing tends to be, can you believe how much this heavy metal music sucks? The music critics hate it. They're like, it's stupid. It's for troglodytes. It's for, fans who have no conception of what good music is. And yet, at the same time, lots of people are buying these records. Lots of people are going to these concerts and they're appreciating it. So the 70s is a really fertile and rich and complicated time. And it's happening in Britain, it's happening in the United States, it's happening to some degree in Germany, and also to some degree in Japan. And then in the mid 70s, things are going to really change. And so one of the handouts that I sent to Rob to send to you is about what we call the Sabbath-Purple nexus. And a nexus is a network. So Black Sabbath and Deep Purple wound up being sort of, what would you call it? Catalysts and halfway houses for all sorts of musicians that passed through who would be part of the really important 1970s and 1980s bands. Black Sabbath, had Ozzy Osbourne as a singer. Eventually, they take on Ronnie James Dio, Ian Gillan, a number of other people as well pass through there. And Dio is going to come right out of Sabbath and form his own massively important band in the 1980s. Dio was also in another band that was arguably a Deep Purple spinoff called Rainbow. And Rainbow is just massively important 1970s heavy metal band that went a little bit pop once Dio left in the 1980s. Whitesnake comes out of that nexus as well. Ian Gillan's Gillan Band is in there, and a number of others as well. So it kind of shows you this networking aspect of people who want to play similar kinds of music, who are learning from each other, who are developing the genre, are going to be really important. And one other thing I'd like to point out about the Sabbath-Purple thing, they're playing similar music, and they're going to be both about equally influential in heavy metal circles. If you look at, say, the development of Japanese metal or British metal, you can see lots and lots of bands who they'd be asked, is Black Sabbath your influence? No, Deep Purple is. We're really into them. It also shows that you can have different setups that are going to work. So Sabbath is what we typically call a 4-piece, and you've got one guy on drums, one guy on bass, one guy on guitar, one guy who's singing. That's a common band configuration. Deep Purple is a little bit more complicated. To add to that, they add an organist, John Lord, who's just absolutely important in the development of heavy metal. And we see other bands taking that on. Rainbow is going to similarly be a 5-piece with bass guitar, or bass, drums in the rhythm section, guitar and organ in the sort of main lead section, and then a singer. So there's lots and lots of ways you can do this. You have 2 guitar bands as well, like Thin Lizzy, like Judas Priest, like later on Iron Maiden. And in the 1970s, in the midpoint of it, heavy metal's chugging along and selling out arenas, clubs. Lots of people are getting attracted to it. The music critics continue to hate it and denigrate it. And then by the mid 70s, we see this really interesting cultural divergence. What are the genres of music that take off in the mid 70s? It's not heavy metal. Heavy metal's been around now for about 5 years. It's going to be disco. And you could say, well, if you're into heavy metal, you're not going to be into disco. Well, I mean, some of the heavy metal bands actually incorporated disco into their stuff. Kiss did a disco album called Dynasty, I think in 78 or 79. And it was punk, and punk was viewed as like, this is the authentic stuff, you know. If you're not going to be glitzy like disco, this is where the real tough guys and rebels are. And heavy metal began to be seen by some people as a kind of moribund. This is older people music. It's not where the youth culture is. At the same time that all of that was officially happening, a massive heavy metal subculture is forming, not only in the UK and in America, but also in Germany, the Low Countries, France to a lesser extent, Scandinavia, Japan, Australia. It's taking off all over. And a lot of upcoming musicians and fans are beginning to coalesce around this, along with some of the hallmark features that we associate with heavy metal lifestyle, like wearing denim or leather, band patches, headbanging, playing air guitar as part of the performance that fans would engage in, throwing the horns. You know, there's debate about who actually came up with it. Probably it was Ronnie James Dio and not Gene Simmons, who claims to have done it. And we see these massive developments happening worldwide. The new wave of British heavy metal scene begins to develop in the late 70s. It's going to emerge in the 80s, but you know, like everything else, it's got to have a sort of catalyzing period. The LA scene starts to become massive. Bands are passing through there all the time. Bands within the LA area, like Van Halen, Quiet Riot, Mickey Rat, are beginning to be really important in the musical scene. And we're going to see bands emerging that are totally influential. We already mentioned Judas Priest, Motorhead, massively influential. The Scorpions are emerging, you know, from 1974 onward as a major force. Kiss plays a huge role. Van Halen starts getting attention in the mid to late 70s. First album is, if I remember right, 77. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of crossover from hard rock to heavy metal as well. So we talked about this idea of metal adjacent that might be of use to you in classifying things. Aerosmith would be a good example of that. Maybe some of their stuff isn't really heavy metal, but if you listen to heavy metal, you probably like Aerosmith. Same thing with AC/DC. You know, they're always saying, we're not a heavy metal band, but they were in the collections of records or tapes that people would have. Bad Company, Nazareth, a band called Ram Jam that's best known for Black Betty. That's arguably a metal song, you know. These are all bands that are, you know, involved in this scene. And a lot of metal fans are also into heavier and harder progressive rock. So bands like Yes or Rush, you know, again, if you're into Judas Priest, you might actually like Rush, you know, because there's some similar things going on. So before we actually get to the 80s, there's this incredibly complex tapestry of history that's taking place. Now, does this allow us to classify metal? It kind of depends on how we want to define things. If we're doing things in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, probably not going to make much progress with that. If, on the other hand, we're looking at something like Wittgensteinian family resemblance definitions, we can talk about musical traits or characteristics. And there is actually projects out there, like Pandora originally used something called the Musical Genome Project that broke songs up into something like 890 different characteristics. You know, what kind of guitar solo goes on? What does the singer sound like? What is the overall atmosphere of it? And so you're probably going to have better luck defining heavy metal using something like that, saying, well, it doesn't have to have all of these characteristics, but there's kind of a core set that you're going to be looking for to call a band or a song or a movement heavy metal. And, the last thing I'll say about this era of the 70s, um, the term is being used by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, some of whom are trying to use it to make a buck. So they're calling things metal that maybe aren't metal. Some of whom are using it to dismiss people and say, this music is crap and nobody should listen to it unless they're an idiot. Some of whom are saying, yeah, I'm heavy metal. I'm a metalhead. This is part of what I do as a musician or a fan. And it's ripe for, exploding in the 1980s into a whole set of movements and a whole set of genres. At the time that this is going on, there are no subgenres. Nobody is thinking about heavy metal as being something that you could divide into power, death, doom, any of these sorts of things. It's one, I won't say one big happy family, because sometimes they hated each other's guts. But it's, you could say, one big movement. So then when we get into the 1980s, metal emerges as a massive commercial and cultural force, particularly among younger people. So teens, 20s, but there are people who are in their 30s and 40s who are listening to it. Some of the big bands are in their 30s or even like approaching their 40s. Ozzy Osbourne, for example, was born the same year as my mom. So Ozzy's as boomer as you can possibly get. But of course, Ozzy was cool in a way that my mom wasn't. So, and similarly with, a lot of these other older bands and musicians. And we're going to see music videos becoming a major force as MTV rises. MTV actually got so many requests for heavy metal videos that they decided to create a separate space called Headbangers Ball so that they could play all the other pop stuff and not have to play metal all the time. And music videos were a way of connecting to fans and telling stories and sharing cool narratives and shaping taste by the way bands looked. Some bands didn't benefit from that. Grim Reaper, arguably a British new wave of British heavy metal band, had a singer who was unfortunately very homely and probably would have done better in a non-video era, than they did in the video era. But if you were photogenic, you could actually make a lot of progress with that. Tours are going on. Concert tickets are much cheaper relative to income than they are today. This may be hard to imagine, but for the price of a few hours work at the pizza parlor or the car wash or something like that, you could go and see two massive bands play in an arena and maybe even like push your way close to the stage and see them when they're active and young. Lots of radio stations start emerging to play metal. Record sales go through the roof. There's also this phenomenon of tape swapping. If your buddy had an album or a tape of a band that you hadn't heard or their newest release, you would copy it. I mean, it was officially piracy, but we all did it back then, and it was pretty common. And there's music magazines. The subculture is in the process of developing. So you could actually think of yourself and have an identity as I'm a metalhead. Changing technology allowed the sounds to become harder, faster, sharper. Lots of cool guitar effects come in. There's better recording techniques. Even new drumming techniques come in, particularly towards the end of the 80s. And there's a lot of musicians and bands that jump onto the heavy metal bandwagon because it's so successful. And, some of them are basically hard rock bands that are incorporating a few elements of metal. I'll give you a few examples that maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. Bon Jovi is not metal, but they got sold as being metal, right? There is a Canadian artist, Lee Aaron, who actually billed herself as the metal queen. She's not heavy metal, but she's made an entire career of doing that sort of thing. Lita Ford, who came from the Runaways, arguably not really metal by comparison to other female artists that genuinely were, like, say, Doro from Warlock, And so there's a lot of people who jump onto the term, and I think that we can make an interesting analogy here to philosophical movements that maybe make sense to you, maybe not. So, is Albert Camus an existentialist or not? Now, if you go to like online sources, no, he's not an existentialist. He's an absurdist. Well, we teach him in existentialism classes, and Albert Camus did label some people as existentialists in the myth of Sisyphus. But if you look at closely at his work, he really does fit in with the other existentialists quite well. And he doesn't have much in common with the people that are called absurdists. So somebody calling themselves heavy metal, does that mean that they're metal? By the 1980s, probably not, because if they did it in the 70s, they probably were, because you weren't going to get much from the critics other than abuse for calling yourself heavy metal. By the 80s, there's a good chance that maybe it's a misclassification. But there's lots of artists who, are heavy metal. And what else happens in the 80s? So because the scene is spreading, and because now there's like an entire decade or more of development and music that you can listen to and talk about, we start to see heavy metal differentiating into recognizable genres. And, one early researcher who you might take a look at, maybe Rob's already talked about her, Dina Weinstein, who has a really good early book called Heavy Metal: A Cultural Sociology, which is from 1991. She divided heavy metal up into three main genres, and you could look at it like a spectrum, right? So on the one hand, you have like the really, really hard, extreme stuff. On the other hand, you have the pop or light, or what often gets called later on hair metal. And so in the middle, you've got whatever you want to call it, the mainstream or traditional heavy metal. So pop or glam was the word that she used, or light metal, light, L-I-T-E, sort of like the famous beer from Milwaukee, which isn't really beer at all, made by the Miller Corporation. This would include bands like Dokken or Motley Crue, or as a worse extreme, Poison, which hardly is metal at all. Kiss kind of fit in there in what they were doing. And then on the other extreme, you have speed or thrash metal, what later comes to be called extreme metal. And this would include bands like Accept or Venom, and then Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, bands like that. And then you got this big middle. And the middle would include the bands that are clearly heavy metal: Dio, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, the Scorpions, some of the LA bands like Armored Saint, who aren't going glam and they're not going thrash, but they're staying kind of middle of the road. And at this time, and Rob can talk about this maybe a bit, for what it was like where he grew up. Where I grew up, there were a lot of controversies within the metal community about what's really metal and what's not. There is this tendency for a lot of us to say, the traditional or mainstream and the thrash or speed, that's really metal. This other light stuff, no, not really metal at all. On the other hand, the glam, the pop, and all that was much more commercially acceptable, got played on the radio a lot more. And gender balance, you had just as many women as men listening to glam stuff, which wasn't the case with thrash metal at all, or even traditional heavy metal. So it was a contested idea already at the time with genres coming out. And there's other subgenres that Weinstein didn't catch at the time that we can say are developing and differentiating in the 1980s. And a really interesting example of how this wasn't happening early on, Kronos, the lead singer and bassist of Venom, when Venom was a very early band, in their development, and they're doing this very rough, scratchy, low production, in your face kind of music that eventually will get called black metal. He's asked what kind of metal they play. And he just rattles off a whole bunch of descriptors. We play power metal, we play speed metal, we play black metal, we play. None of these actually have the senses that they do today. He's using them evocatively rather than descriptively or in a classificatory way. He's using them more as metaphors. There's power behind what we do rather than saying, I belong to the movement called power metal. And so, we see some interesting philosophy of language stuff coming up here. What are the different ways in which we use language? And in order to develop a genre, you really have to have a consistent set of bands and sounds and emphases. It takes a lot to develop a musical subgenre within heavy metal. So, we get black metal. Venom is one of the important bands, Bathory, Merciful Fate, Celtic Frost. There's a scene that forms, and then other bands can pick that up and say, hey, what we do is this kind of stuff, and we're inspired by these guys over here. Another important, massively important right now, but also important in the 80s is death metal. Possessed, Death Obituary, Morbid Angel. These are early bands that are contributing to that. We also see power metal emerging with like Blind Guardian and Halloween and Stratovarius. And you notice those are European bands. Those are not American or British bands, right? Whereas you can say that some of these other things are happening in these places. Neoclassical metal, Yngwie Malmsteen is a very important early person. Vinnie Moore, another important one. And then, one that I'm particularly into, doom metal. This goes all the way back to Black Sabbath. But in the late 70s and 1980s, you get Pentagram, St. Vitus, Witchfinder General, these bands that are making that kind of sound. And then other people will come along and say, I want to be like them. We want to do this sort of thing. There's other genres you notice in contemporary metal that we aren't talking about because, again, they didn't exist in the 70s or the 80s. So folk metal, cool genre, wasn't really a thing in the 80s, identifiable as such. There are some things that are genres that aren't really genres. Christian metal, there was Petra and Stryper, which were basically Christian glam. What made it Christian metal is they had lyrics that were Christian oriented. And I think at least in theory, they didn't indulge in vices that were viewed as non-Christian. So they were, being metal, but leaving out the hedonistic side of heavy metal, and definitely any sort of occult or devil worshiping stuff as well. They're doing the opposite of that. So we see these subgenres emerging, and all of this is complicating the question, okay, what is heavy metal? Right? Because if you're involved in death metal, you might use the term to mean the stuff that you listen to and the stuff that you like. And that other stuff over there, not really metal at all. And I think that in a lot of cases, we get into an interesting definitional issue that also arises in philosophy. A lot of people, when they're asked, is this philosophy of a particular author, they'll say, no, that's not philosophy. That's something else instead. And what they mean, first of all, there's no consensus on what a definition of philosophy is. There's never been any accepted consensus definition throughout all of Western philosophy's history. But what a lot of people mean when they say this is philosophy or not, what they really mean is this is what I think good philosophy is. not just what philosophy is. So, for example, hopefully I won't offend anybody here who's an objectivist. Ayn Rand, a lot of people in academic philosophy will say she's not a philosopher at all. No, she is. She's a philosopher. She's just not a very good one, you know, but she's certainly doing things that are philosophical. They're within the realm of it. She loves Aristotle for kind of the wrong reasons, hates Kant and Plato for the wrong reasons, but she's certainly doing something that's, rational argumentation and identifying, her premises and trying to provide evidence and all that. It's just not particularly good. So, if you're asked, is this heavy metal or not? Sometimes the answer might be, well, yeah, it's just not the kind of metal I'm into, whereas some people will say, no, that's not metal at all. And what they mean is, I don't like it, right? Or this doesn't sound familiar to me. And notice that from the perspective of the present, if we go back into the 70s and you listen to, say, Rainbow, or the Scorpions from the 1970s, somebody who's used to listening to black and death metal right now might say, that stuff doesn't sound like metal to me, but it is heavy metal because it's part of heavy metal's development. And it's what people in the present who belong to the subgenre called traditional heavy metal would say definitely is heavy metal. So, this may be a little disappointing to you, this run through things, if you were hoping that I would give you a nice, neat definition somewhere along the line. It's more like sketching out a bunch of contours that help us understand, how this genre developed. And before, we do Q&A and discussion, I'll just say, just really briefly, the 90s and the 2000s. The 90s were not a decade particularly receptive to traditional heavy metal. Grunge came on the scene, got really pushed by the record companies and by MTV and VH1. A lot of traditional heavy metal bands started to fall on rougher times. Glam really took a nosedive. Thrash actually did just fine. They were, continuing to evolve. Some of Megadeth's best stuff came out in the 90s, I would say. The metal subculture didn't go completely away, but it did get cut into quite a bit. At the same time, this is when the genres proliferate. People are willing to say, I don't just play death metal, I play this kind of death metal. Or, I'm going to play folk metal, and it's going to be Viking metal. Pirate metal, by the way, emerges around this time, incorporating sea shanties and stuff like that. A lot of cool stuff is happening in the 90s. There's bands that are doing weird time signature stuff like Prong. I'm not even sure how to classify them. Bands just doing weirdness per se, like Primus. Which originally they were into Rush, by the way. So I guess you could say they're prog. Some really great alternative metal bands come out. Tool, who's still around, Alice in Chains, who are more metal than grunge. But there's a lot of really important changes that are happening, and a lot of them are going to be due to the internet. So the music industry rapidly changed from about, say, 1995 onward. File sharing is an issue. There's all sorts of legal battles that Metallica got involved with. People were like, these guys aren't quite so cool anymore now that they're telling me I shouldn't trade files or anything. And what we end up seeing is the music industry over the last 20 years or so has been consolidating in ways that are particularly tough on artists and to some degree tough on fans. So there's this wide proliferation of stuff. If you subscribe to Spotify, you can get stuff that Rob and I, when we were young, wouldn't even have dreamed of having in our catalog, didn't even know existed. But the musicians are getting almost nothing from it. And so who's actually benefiting? It's very difficult for younger bands to develop and come up and have a viable income source. Most of what they get nowadays is through ticket sales, which is why it's so expensive to go to concerts, and merch. They're not making it off of album sales or anything like that. And so, we may see some difficulties. At the same time, metal is still a massively uh, widespread, strong, vital musical genre. There's all sorts of bands that kind of hung it up for a while. And then in the 2000s, there was enough of a fan base for them to get together and say, let's make some more records, let's go tour again. Some bands never stopped touring. Raven is a prime example of a heavy metal band that started in the 1970s, never broke up, even dealt with one of their members having his back broken when a bunch of stacks fell over on the poor guy. Has continually put out records, but Raven also had to do a Kickstarter for their album in 2015. And they had to sell some of their gear in order to pay for the album production. So it shows you some of the difficulties involved, even for established bands. And we live now in a time when, if you want to get into heavy metal, there's very low barriers to it. You don't have to accumulate a record collection or tape collection. You don't even have to engage with other human beings. You can just go online and do some research. And, if you want to, you can go to concerts and enjoy it that way. You can get involved in all sorts of online groups as well. So it's kind of a cool time in that way. But it's also led to these challenges of people inhabiting very narrow silos, you could say. The genres, there are some people who will only listen to this genre. And part of what's been lost in that is this mode of interconnection that we were talking about earlier. In the 70s or 80s, if you were into a particular band, there were a lot of other bands that people would suggest you're probably also going to like this sort of stuff. Or, something would come out and your friends would say to you, wow, holy crap, you got to hear this. This is the newest record by so-and-so, or you've never heard these people before. You got to check this out. I think there's maybe a little bit less of that, or there's less possibility for it to get diffused throughout the culture. So that's all the notes that I've prepared. So a lot of music history, some speculations about the nature of the genre and temporality and how we got to where we are. Not a lot of big philosophical theses to identify or defend, but arguably what we're doing here is some philosophical reflection on the genre. So I'm open to any questions or comments you've got. Anything you want to clarify?
Yeah, well, let's take a second to thank Greg for talking to us about this.
Oh, thanks.
And yeah, any questions or comments or things you want to bug him about?
Things you think I got wrong?
Yeah, yes, sir.
So in your Medium article, you said that trying to define heavy metal by using Black Sabbath as a link to define heavy metal is nonsense. But in your talk today, you kind of linked it back to Black Sabbath in a way. So my question is, why isn't it a good link? Even though there's another article that we read,
Yeah.
Soren Fremont,
Yeah.
they argued that everything like with Wittgenstein's
Yeah.
concept of familial resemblance, everything kind of goes back to Black Sabbath. So
well, except
do you know that article, Greg? It's in the Black Sabbath and Philosophy collection.
Oh, yeah.
Black Sabbath and the problem of defining metal. I don't know if you know it.
Yeah,
what he calls a prototype theory.
The trouble is that factually, it doesn't all go back to Black Sabbath. What people were calling heavy metal was just as much connected. And so Black Sabbath, you could say, is the first among equals. but the equals in 1970 already include Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, UFO, and some of the other bands that are out there about ready to produce albums. So, I mean, to call it nonsense maybe goes a little bit too far, but the idea that Black Sabbath is like the paradigm band, it's just not true. At least when we're looking at the time period, you could say that they exemplify at the best, and I'm perfectly fine to say that, until other bands come along. I mean, Rainbow arguably in the Dio era just as well fulfills all the traits that we want. Judas Priest too, coming around the same time. And I'm also not a fan of the let's figure out where the origin point is and use that as a definition. Right? I think those are two different kinds of things. One is a question of origins and influence. The other is a question of how to classify things.
Yeah. So Freeman Miller's point is a bit more subtle, I think. I don't know if you've read that.
It's been a long time.
Yeah. I mean, so he talks about, he says he thinks all genres have prototypes, right? That, in virtue of a variety of things that could include luck or, historical situatedness and stuff like, become sort of this central sort of thing, but that can move around over time.
Yeah.
And subdivide, and he actually puts forward the thesis that I think is too strong, right? That everything that's heavy metal is either influenced by Sabbath or influenced by somebody who is influenced by Sabbath.
Yeah, which clearly is not the case.
Yeah,
I mean, the one band that gets talked about as much as Sabbath in the early years, who influenced you? Deep Purple.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, I'd be willing to say, okay, Sabbath could certainly be the origin of doom metal if we want to get into subgenres, right?
Yeah.
But we run into problems with that because, okay, well, who's the origin of black metal? Well, Venom, of course, except that Venom doesn't really sound like whatever we call black metal today,
What about Merciful Fate?
Well, they're coming. Yeah, I suppose they're not coming that much later. Yeah, and they are much closer to what we call it. But Venom had that album Black Metal, and that's part of why it got its name,
Yeah, right.
right? I mean, could you say that like Yngwie Malmsteen is the origin point of neoclassical metal? Probably, except for the fact that Richie Blackmore, in interview after interview in the 70s will say, my inspiration is not the blues, it's classical music.
Yeah.
So
but
I don't know.
We can distinguish this prototype idea from origin point, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's
Okay.
where it's all started. May not be the same thing as, well, this has become the prototype, right? And I think you could maybe argue, so I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate.
Let me throw another term in there. Maybe we could say we got origin point and prototype, and then we got paradigm, right?
Yeah.
So if we're talking about black metal, okay, maybe Venom is an origin point, but I'm kind of one that's not going to be all that stable. And then Merciful Fate is an early paradigm,
Yeah.
even though they're not the first,
Right. So, I mean, I think you could maybe make the case that, tell me what you think about this, right? By the late 70s, Deep Purple has dropped out of a co-paradigm a bit.
Well, it depends on where we're looking. I mean, if we're looking at Japanese metal, which is forming in the late 70s primarily, and then in the 80s, just as many bands are saying that their inspiration is Deep Purple or even the Scorpions as they are Black Sabbath. And when we look at who so like here's a great example: Bruce Dickinson, Iron Maiden, right? Who does he really admire as a singer? It's not Ozzy. He wants to be Ian Gillan, and he's listening to that. Steve Harris,
Yeah.
one of the greatest bassists and one of the greatest band leaders, the bassist and band leader of Iron Maiden. Yes, UFO and Deep Purple are the ones he's looking to, not Black Sabbath. So I don't know. I mean, I think that again, I'm not going to like say that Black Sabbath isn't massively important. I just
Right.
contest it's mostly about Sabbath, or they were the
I
real
don't think they're uniquely
originators.
important.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that proto metal existed, and people in Sabbath and Deep Purple and Uriah Heep are listening to these earlier guys, or Uli von Roth, really important lead guitarist for the Scorpions in the early to mid to late 70s. Who does he think he wants to be? He wants to be Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah.
So I mean, where do we want to go with this? It's probably a mistake to try to make too much out of Black Sabbath. I mean, Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler are an incredibly talented set of songwriters,
Sure.
and just massively influential. It doesn't look like, other than his voice, Ozzy Osbourne contributed anything to the group, because they can sub in better singers like Dio or even Tony Martin, for that matter, and get plenty of mileage out of it. And it's not clear that Bill Ward, the drummer, actually made really great contributions either. He might have been dispensable in a way that Butler and Iommi weren't.
Yeah. Other questions, concerns? Yeah.
As you were listing off like the countries that metal kind of originated in, I kind of noticed that there were very like westernized, like capitalistic countries. So I'm wondering, talk about kind of how that like rebellion against that system influenced metal a bit.
Sure. Yeah. And they were capitalist countries that were in crisis, where things had gone downhill. And, where do you see metal emerging? It's not in the very prosperous places. It's in crappy places like, Manchester, Birmingham, Detroit. I mean, Detroit is actually a lot more prosperous in the late 60s and early 70s than it is today, but it was definitely in decline. Yeah, I mean, so some of the same social forces that are going to lead to punk later on are there in metal, but it's taking a somewhat different direction. You're not seeing, other than like, say Sabbath's War Pigs or things like that, an awful lot of social critique presented as like, here's an actual program that we could follow. There tends to be a lot more, sort of talk about like, let's tear it all down, or escaping into fantasy, think about like Rainbow, or hedonism, or stuff like that. And so, metal always got accused of being politically disengaged, interestingly, really through the 80s. And then of course there were bands who would like take stands on things, but that, I think that is part of its approach. More emphasis on like virtuosity than you see in punk. That was one thing that Steve Harris was often asked, is Iron Maiden, influenced by punk? And he's like, yeah, because we hate those guys. They're terrible at playing, so we're going to be what they're not at all. Now, it's interesting if you think about where else does metal take off. Japan. Japan is a ground not just for the formation of new Japanese bands, but it's also a great place to tour for metal bands, a reliable fan base and income for them. Why are the youth into that? Because they see something that they're not getting in the rest of their culture. I mean, it does actually raise a lot of interesting questions, this connection with capitalism, because how do you actually stay afloat as a band? You've got to sell tickets, you've got to sell records, you've got to go out there and sell yourself, and you got to deal with record companies, and you've got to be available for interviews with the magazines, which are all for-profit things. You've got to be willing to go on TV shows. And so there's this paradox or tension. Are you selling out? You know? And can you really remain authentic as you start making tons of money? You know? And actually, I'll bring up a metal band, arguably a metal band, an alternative band from the 90s that my wife and I saw in concert just 2 years ago, and we're very disappointed by. Rage Against the Machine, right? The members of Rage Against the Machine, it's debatable how much they can identify with the working class because they're multimillionaires. And it was really interesting to go to a Rage Against the Machine concert because they don't talk to the audience at all. There is zero engagement with the fan base who's ponied up tons of money to actually be there, lining up to buy their merch, you know, and you're like, what is these guys at one time were, you know, critics of capitalism. What's going on here? You know, they're just here to like do their performance, get their money, and get the hell out of Alpine Valley, you know. And so there's I think there's a good bit of that winds up coming in along the way. How much can you resist the need to sell out, right? So, but in the early
we could
years,
bring that up with Metallica, obviously.
Oh.
It's a huge one, right?
yeah,
It's a huge one that people talk about these days, right? I mean, now they're selling out multiple night events at the biggest arenas in the world. You know, come a long way from the guys with like one pair of jeans for the entire tour and stuff that they were doing. You know, they once got in a car wreck here in Laramie, Wyoming.
Oh, really?
Their bus broke down. You guys know this legend?
No.
Yeah, so back, I think it was on their like Kill 'Em All tour. And they were driving across I-80 and they either like went off into a snow plow, it went off into a snowbank, or it broke down or whatever. They ended up getting stuck accidentally here in Laramie. Rumor has it they almost got beat up at the Cowboy Bar, because they all had the long hair and everything back then. But yeah, no, it's in one of those biographies of their early days. It's pretty funny.
That's when they were still a very intense metal band as well. I mean, their first accusation of selling out came with their first really massively successful album, the Black Album. And a lot of us were super Metallica fans until that came out. And then we're like, what the hell are they doing? You know?
Well, and a lot of it too was like the loss of Cliff Burton at the time too. A lot of people didn't seem to be able to like let that go either, right?
That's true. Yeah. I mean, that goes to show. So one of the things we didn't talk about that I think is a really interesting philosophical issue is what goes into the formation of the sound. So we talked just briefly about, if we're talking about Black Sabbath, it really is Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler, and then whoever they happen to have with them. And maybe that person makes a big contribution like Ronnie James Dio did. They were like super happy to have a guy who could actually write his own lyrics and contribute to the songwriting until they weren't. And then they're like, you got to get the hell out of here, buddy, you know? And, you know, with Cliff Burton, massively important in the songwriting in Metallica. The loss of him probably is reflected in the existence of the Black Album, because I don't think he would have signed off on that at all, given where he was before. But, you know, thinking about influence, which I want to say is actually a metaphysical concept, you know, and it's causal. It's hard to trace out. I think that's really ripe for philosophical exploration, and then looking at influence not just from one group on another group, or musician on musician, like how Eddie Van Halen's style of guitar playing influenced so many other people, or Steve Harris's bass playing influenced so many other people, but also within a group, who decides where the sound is going. Like in Judas Priest, for example, we found this out by reading his biography a couple of years ago. KK Downing, for years, for decades, felt like he was sidelined in the songwriting when Glenn Tipton joined the group. And I think a lot of it's kind of sour grapes, but he makes claims that might actually be verifiable. Like, how many solos does this guy write? How many solos does this guy write? We could look at the proportions of that. Or who decides where the group is going as you're moving into new times, musical taste change. Are you going to go along with it? Like Kiss did with their Dynasty album, which is disco, with some heavy metal stuff behind it.
Heavy disco influence for sure.
Yeah. A lot of people consider that a real misstep, but those guys clearly thought at the time that was the way to go.
They still sold a lot of them.
Yeah. And they still play a few of the songs from that as part of their set lists. They have become fan favorites, even though, like I Was Made for Loving You. People listened to that and demanded at concerts.
We got time for maybe one more before we should let Greg go. Anybody? Yeah, Lauren.
So you talked about like the transition from the 80s to the 90s and how a bunch of bands started to struggle sort of to stay afloat, if you will. One of the things that like came out of the 90s was nu metal, and a bunch of people thought it was like smart to blend the metal sound with other things. Some people thought it was a cop out and it was like tainting the metal scene. So what do you think about that?
I think the good nu metal is great. And then a lot of it was just kind of puttering around with stuff and trying to see what would actually work. And it is interesting when we look at not just musical eras, but we could talk about this in terms of literature or other things, TV shows. We generally focus on like the winners, right? The ones who manage to pull things off. For every good nu metal or alternative metal, or prong doing weird time signatures, putting things into 7/8 time, for every one of those bands there's like a whole bunch of losers who just made terrible music. And it's interesting because we got to see, not in the 90s era, but a band from the 80s era. My wife and I, we went down to Chicago to see Rat, and we're lucky because we got to see like the last, arguably close to the original configuration of that band that was available, and it'll never happen again. And there was a band that was opening for them called Diamond Rex, and they were like a Chicago metal band, a glam band. And they got up and we were like, well, who are these guys? So we got on our phones and we're kind of like Googling who's Diamond Rex. And they were just god awful. You were like, well, I can see why these guys never made it out, why they never caught on, because they suck. It's cool that they're still around today, but hopefully their set is short so we can actually see the band that they came here for. And even the Chicago people that were there to like see Rat were not like enthused about Diamond Rex. There were a few people up in the front who had Diamond Rex shirts and stuff like that, and you could like tell that the band was just not into it. And I kind of think the stuff in the 90s, there were like CDs that we would buy and we'd be like, oh, this band's going to be great. And we'd get the CD and there's like one good song on it, and then you're like, well, do I sell the CD back? Do I pass it on to some other sucker? But there were a lot of really cool things that did develop in the 90s. Ways of taking metal and connecting it up with other things. I would say, by the way, when it comes to like connecting metal with genres like, say, rap, right? Which is what a lot of nu metal is doing in one way or another. Anthrax was an early precursor to that. And so was Faith No More, you know. They were doing some cool stuff, which kind of opened the door for people to appreciate that. And I think too, it also shows, and I'd be curious to hear what other people have to say about this. You know, like, so you're into metal and you like some of the key things, like there being a heavy sound that's distorted, guitar riff, um, aggressive, you know, tempo and stuff like that. But somebody brings something else into it. You could be like, this doesn't belong, right? Or you could be like, oh, that's kind of cool. Sort of like, you know, when we have coffee, and for a long time, people were just like, well, it's just coffee. That's all you get. And then there were the possibility of having hazelnut coffee and Irish cream coffee. And we were like, wow, this is amazing, you know? I mean, you could look at the mixing of musical genres like that. I mean, I think this is a bit of a editorializing and side note. I think in other genres, that mixing and matching has really messed up the genre. Like, and I'll single out country for this. Much of what gets called country these days is not remotely country. It's pop songs with some guitar twang and talking about, you know, a six pack and driving a truck, but it's actually just pop. You know, it's not identifiably country. And so you got these dividing lines. Where do you actually stray into the other thing can be kind of tricky. So I mean, to answer the question, the good stuff that came out of the 90s, I'm all for that. There was a lot of garbage, but there was a lot of garbage every decade, you know? So,
For sure.
yeah.
Sure. Awesome. Well, Greg, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for
Yeah.
your questions. And
we could talk about this all day long, but I'm sure you have other things to do. I've got to show them about early extreme metal here in a bit. So we're gonna do a little
cool.
Venom and Merciful Fate and some of that stuff. So
Nice.
awesome. So thanks so much again, Greg. We'll be in touch soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I hope all of you students have a great time with the course. You know, I wish I had gotten to take something like this back in college, but professors weren't interested in that. They'd see
No,
you.
apparently not.
Yeah, I mean, they thought if you listened to heavy metal back then that you were kind of a scumbag. So
Yeah. And not entirely wrong, right? But at least for some of us. Okay, thanks, Greg. We'll see you later.
all right, I'll see all of you.